All right, welcome to sig-auth for December 9th, 2020. Let me try and share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, the first two items on here are carried over from last week since we didn't get to them. Andrew, would you like to pose your question?
Sure. Hopefully this item should be reasonably short, maybe famous last words. I just wanted to take this opportunity to maybe give a quick status on Clientgo credential plugin API, as well as validate some assumptions and maybe get a quick answer to a question I have. So my assumption, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the next minute or two, is that it's still valuable to the community to get this Clientgo credential plugin API to GA. Judging by the KEP, it looks like the next steps between here and GA are to write some end-to-end tests and write some docs. I would be interested in contributing any or all of those things roughly for the 121 timeline, if time allows. So my question is, what if we want to get this API to GA, like what powers it need to be contacted? I would assume someone outside of the SIG needs to like give a thumbs up or something of that measure in order to get an API to GA. But what, like, if we want to try to get this API to GA in 121, like who else in the community needs to be brought in on that conversation?
So I linked to the beta to GA graduation that you mentioned. So making sure that all the things in that list are like we can point to why we think those are satisfied. There are a few known issues, a couple known issues. I'll link to one around like creating lots of copies of an exec provider. So we want to do due diligence around that and make sure that the things that people are reporting to us in the beta phase, we are actually resolving. So that's the point of this time. In terms of people outside the SIG, SIG release and API review, those are the two main groups that we need to interface with. So once SIG release sets up the timeline for 121, we will know when the feature freeze date is, and we'll need to make sure that this enhancement is tracked for the release if we're wanting to graduate it. And then as part of the promotion to V1, there'll be an API review step. Several of the folks on the call are actually involved in that as well, so that'll be a pretty easy handoff, but that's the main other group outside the SIG that we'd want to make sure we're on their radar and get stuff done early enough to have review bandwidth.
Cool. That sounds good. Yeah, thanks for bringing up that issue. I'd forgotten about that one. Okay, that makes sense. I think it's my understanding, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that when contributing like integration tests or end-to-end tests, that you just CC the SIG that oversees the functionality that is being tested, not SIG testing. So I may try to hack on that a bit over the next couple months and post a contribution there. This is all helpful. I'm sensing that it's still valuable, so that's great to hear. I think unless anyone else had anything on this item, I'm good to go.
Yep, definitely still valuable. Thanks for contributing there. All right. By the way, I moved pod security policy to the end, not because I don't want to talk about it, but because it has a way of filling up whatever time there is. So I want to make sure we get to the other items first.
I mean, I was expecting just to be like, hey, y'all, we're still here. We're working on what we promised. But
Okay. Okay, we'll get to that. Ahmed, you on the call? Looks like Ahmed is not on the call. Do SPiffy client certificates just work? I know we generally support client certificates. Anyone know?
No, they don't, because they put the SPiffy ID in the SAN, and the common name is the UID.
Got it. I mean, if like a UID unique to the credential or unique to the user?
Unique to the certificate. Yeah, to the credential.
I see. Okay.
So I think the work would be like deciding that, yes, this is a thing first class that we would want to support, and then determining whether we want it to like match the service account. Like if you're issuing it for a service account, should it also look like a service account token's identity? Or should it just be the string that's in the SAN getting passed through that you can then write policy about?
Do you know if there's any ongoing work or if anyone's looking into this?
I know we're poking around a little bit and folks are interested. I mean, I'm assuming that's why Ahmed was posing this. I don't know if we have any of those other folks on the call.
Yeah, just to chime in, I think I'm working with Tahir here on this, and the idea was we just wanted to know if someone else is working on this, just to get a better understanding, and if there's no duplication of work.
It might be worth sending a message to the mailing list, just in case there are people not on the call, to get a broader audience to ask that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
That makes sense.
Sorry, I'm here now. I was dropping my son off at preschool.
No worries. Did you have anything to add on this?
Not particularly. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's follow up on the mailing list. All right. Next up, Shurhong, are you on the call?
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether we can, because we have the partner service account token volume that will be beta in the next release. I'm just wondering whether we can disable token controller. One point that I pointed out by Mike Denise is that some use cases that they will like rely on this functionality to be available, because they may want to assume that token controller is available, but I don't think it's going to be useful for the new use cases, right? So I'm just wondering, is there a safe way to disable it or deprecate it?
Yeah, it's a good topic to think about. Now that we actually have a like a reasonable path to bound service account tokens, like the next step is how can we stop putting credentials in secret?
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea of a per service account way to opt out. We already have a per service account way to opt out of auto mounting tokens into pods, letting specific creators of specific service accounts say, I know I'm going to use this with bound tokens. I don't need tokens and secrets. That'd be kind of nice. We could do that in Cube System namespace with the service accounts we set up for Controller Manager, which already use token request to get ephemeral tokens. I don't know. I like the idea. I think it needs to be described in a little mini cap, but I like it. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe have a similar way as the automate that knob you provided for the name for the service count. So.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it would be valuable to have a namespace level, and probably eventually we're going to want a cluster level knob as well. So being able to have all three of those.
Could the namespace one be done by like a admission policy on top of whatever we come up for the service account one?
Yeah.
The only hesitation I have is around API surface for a thing that right now is controller driven. And I think super long term, we would like to go away completely.
Beta annotation.
No, David, do you have thoughts around?
I definitely know people who are relying on the fact that they can get a service account token this way.
Sure.
I'm trying to think about if it was an explicit opt-out, why would anyone ever bother to use the explicit opt-out? Like I know a few select people will be awesome and they'll do it. The idea of turning it on within like enforcing that via admission, I would break a lot of stuff if I turned that on in my clusters on upgrade, like thinking through that.
Yeah. Honestly, like Cube Controller Manager created service accounts are probably the highest value place these could be used. Like those are service accounts Cube Controller Manager sets up and manages credentials for, and if it opted out of populating credentials for those things and secrets, that would make Cube system listing secrets way less valuable than it currently is, which would be kind of nice. For other people, I agree. I don't know that other people would like trouble themselves to opt out of this. Maybe they would, but probably not.
I would.
Tim would, but we all know Tim's awesome.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I'm not writing features to protect myself from Tim. I'm writing features to protect myself from everybody else in the world.
My point there being a little bit, I imagine that it'll be a long tail before the Kubernetes providers can turn this on. But I think end users might want to opt into this.
Yeah, so maybe the annotation versus field thing could be part of the discussion in the CAP, and we can talk about it. I like the ability to opt out. I like the ability to opt out, especially for the Cube system service accounts. So would anyone not want to see this proposed and thought through and made possible? Great.
I'm still trying to see how it ends. I guess I can see how it patches like an individual hole in can you read Cube system, but I still struggle with how it moves the needle overall towards getting people to not depend on you get a secret here.
I think the Cube system one is actually significant given the power of some of the Cube Controller Manager service accounts.
I think it also like gives the pathway for that communication to happen, because today it's like, hey, you can go turn this thing off if you know how to fuck with the cluster config, but there's no way to say by default these things will still be around. You should go in the things you care about, make them not available by policy.
Okay.
All right, I'll try to type up some of what we just talked about. Feel free to contribute to the notes.
All right, thanks. Micah, you're up.
Hey, yeah, so I have been doing some thinking about the kind of the just threat modeling on Kubernetes and how nodes can create mirror pods and how that is like a known attack pattern. Like I think Tim, you and Greg talked about this at KubeCon last year. For anyone who's not aware, basically if a node is compromised, there's a number of different things that can go wrong after that. Basically, nodes can create what are called mirror pods, which are local only to that node. They cannot get scheduled somewhere else, but they can't use things like service accounts, also called like static pods. Can't use things like service accounts, config map mounts into the pod, but they can have arbitrary labels. And so a maliciously taken over node could create a pod that say has the cube DNS or core DNS labels and start redirecting DNS requests. And then the service controller would update endpoints for the DNS service and start sending DNS requests to that, to a fake pod or a possibly fake pod on that node. Same for any other in-cluster service. So if you have an in-cluster webhook, like say an Istio webhook that's adding sidecars, you could hypothetically, if you took over a node, you could impersonate any webhook or add a pod that is behind a webhook service and start doing anything any webhook in the cluster has permission to modify.
And that would require having the serving cert that matched, since we validated TLS, right? So they hadn't found that. Okay.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
And how would they have found that? Well, okay. Well, I guess I can assume some cases they might know.
Right. Yep. Again, you're right. If there's TLS for a webhook, yes, they might not be able to get that. But say DNS requests, they might be able to answer for. Hopefully they're using TLS everywhere else, but that's, as we know, that's not always the case.
Isn't it required for webhooks?
It is required for webhooks.
It is required for webhooks and for aggregate.
But if say a DNS request gets answered and there's some other service that's not using TLS in the cluster or external to the cluster, that could be, pointed to some malicious source. So trying to think about how do we mitigate those kind of attack patterns. One of the thoughts that's come up is how can we have a knob that prevents the node from creating these mirror pods. Obviously that would break certain setups, people who are using that. But even giving administrators, the ability to limit how bad things can happen. Because say you're doing everything right in a hardened cluster, you're still sort of susceptible to this attack pattern. And I guess I wanted to get input here on kind of if a knob for this, disabling this is worth adding. Is deprecating mirror pods altogether a more worthy thing to do? What do folks here think about that? And what are kind of next steps to sort of solve some of these kind of problems?
I think I'd be against trying to deprecate and remove static pods entirely. I think static pods serve important use cases and allow, certain deployment models entirely to function. The ability to have a pod running without a connection to an API server.
What's the use case for those having labels?
That's what I was wondering.
You can actually direct service traffic to them. So you can create a service for your static pods. I happen to know at least one distribution doing this.
So Micah, is the only gap around service routing and traffic stealing and pods with labels like jumping into being endpoints for existing services that weren't expecting that? Is that the main?
To my knowledge, yeah, that's the main thing here is that like you can yes, if you take over node, you can dynamically run anything you want. So that's not the concern. It's more the controllers, like the service and endpoint controllers that are creating these and actually routing traffic to those.
Mm-hmm. I would say that is the known vulnerability here, but I think mirror pods represent a pretty big attack surface. and the ability to, I think there's a value in being able to block those entirely for the unknown unknowns, as they say.
But then also similarly, if I wanted to drop a manifest into the appropriate directory to get a pod running that I don't want people to see, I would appreciate it not showing up as a mirror pod, because then it would not be visible. And I mean, I suppose the counter argument to that is, if you want to do that, just run it yourself directly with Docker or with CRI, CTL, or whatever. But it does seem like something that you would want to think about according to your threat model.
Yeah, I mean, you could capture it in the audit logs as a rejected request. I did paste a link in the chat to a proposal that I put out a while back for placing label restrictions on mirror pods for this exact threat that we're talking about. I didn't follow through with this because I realized it's hard to roll this out on Cube's system and kind of the like managed namespaces. I didn't have a good solution for that at the time. Yeah, I think there's some follow-up work to do there. But I'm also still interested in discussing blocking mirror pods. Of course, you could always just do that with an admission controller webhook anyway.
Do we think that there's just, I guess, my question is, do we think that there's not enough like, is this just like behavior that's too difficult to deprecate or remove or too fine grained to add a knob for, and the answer should just be add a webhook for? Because adding a webhook is kind of, I mean, I guess it's not totally the problem. Like we said earlier, there's TLS around webhooks, but like an in-cluster webhook is still, if there was a way to get a certificate, like a node that had a certificate for that webhook or something, then it kind of doesn't matter. I guess you might use an out of tree controller configured on the Cube API server, some sort of admission webhook there. But
yeah, I mean, static pods are really widely used. Static pods are really widely used. If you have static pods, I guess technically you could have static pods that don't get mirrored.
That would make them really hard to manage.
It's hard to manage. The kubelet usage gets squirrely. Like the scheduler doesn't know what resources are in use. You could have static pods without labels or with constrained labels, which is more narrowly focused at the service routing issue. But like Tim says, like it's a big surface area. I guess for clusters that aren't using static pods and have no intention of using them, this would be nice to just turn off.
But that also seems narrow enough to have an admission webhook to do it.
It does. I'm trying to think, if you had an admission webhook that was running, could a node add a mirror pod with labels that would make it act as the admission webhook?
Only if it already had the secret bound to it, right? And if you already have the secret bound to it, then you're already running that pod, and there's no reason to start a mirror pod for it because you have the actual pod, and you can do what you want. I wouldn't be against adding a label restriction, like only these nodes can set these labels on their mirror pods, and that would still satisfy the use cases that I know of, because usually when people deploy these things, they'll say like, okay, I'm gonna have a static pod, it's gonna run on nodes that look like this, maybe all nodes, but usually nodes that look like this, and they're the only ones that I expect to set the label for foo.
So in the case where you didn't expect any static pods, you could just say, don't allow any labels. Like I don't expect anything. And you could be confident that services would never route to a static pod.
Yeah. And in the case where you had a static pod and you had a service that exposed it for, I don't know, metrics, for instance, you would be able to say, yep, I want this node to be able to set the thing that the flag that indicates, yep, I am part of this service for metrics gathering purposes.
What do you think, Micah?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. Like, I don't want to just say because we're not using it, no one else should. But I do want to, like, I guess I want to understand too, if this is something like that seems sensible to put in tree, or is this like a just go implement your own webhook and this is just a policy issue?
Again, this ties into the pod security policy discussion. It's kind of a general question. Like this is something that would be very straightforward to implement with OPA or Gatekeeper. But that said, I'm also in favor of kind of restricting this as a known vulnerability. But I guess that, again, it's like running vulnerability. Sorry.
How would that work with Gatekeeper? If static pods are just dropping a file, right? Or creating an endpoint that Kubelet is watching.
Mirror pods are required. I forget if it's an annotation or a label on it. So you could say, if it's a mirror pod, then you're not allowed to have any of these labels.
You could still run on a node, it just wouldn't register.
It's preventing the node from registering information about those things into the API in ways that
I see.
Program the network and do other things.
Yeah.
The one downside I could see of admission policy is the like race at the beginning. I don't know how much that matters. That if you have things that are bootstrapping your controllers, that maybe the API server comes alive and some persistent thing on a node manages to sneak in a mirror pod.
Well, Jordan is working on the statically configured, dynamically configured admission webhooks.
Yeah.
So
that fixes that.
I still owe Daniel a meeting on that.
I'm waiting.
What I'm hearing is, sounds like out of tree is probably more preferable here, just because it's more of a, I guess, a policy type thing.
I mean, there is this cap that's already merged that proposes an in-tree version of this. I think it needs to be revisited.
You should link to that.
I did it in the chat.
we did. We talked about it long ago. Tim Hawken, like a year ago. The issue was around, like, there are use cases for setting these labels, and we never really fleshed out what a policy would be. Like, would it be around sets of nodes are able to specify certain labels? We never really described how that could happen.
Okay, I propose we kind of follow up on that cap and what a policy might look like for this offline.
Cool, thanks.
All right, next up, Nick, are you on the call? Yeah.
Yeah. So I just, as I was looking into this, I came across this issue. It looks like it's been discussed before. So I kind of just wanted to understand where the discussion left off with some sort of a mechanism to allow for request signing in clients, and whether the community was open. I didn't see any KEPs in progress or anything like that specifically regarding this, but I might have missed one. So I just wanted to understand what where the conversation left off and whether people were open to a KEP in this area. And I can go into more detail on what I'm thinking, but I'm not sure how fresh this conversation is in people's minds.
I'm paging this back.
So I'll just add a little bit of detail. It looks like MoCon created this issue, and I'll just quote, on the client side, we do not have a good story. The exec credential plugin mechanism is not designed for this purpose. In particular, Clientgo expects to cache the credential until it expires or the process exits. The request information is not passed to the exec plugin. Calling an external process per request also seems like a bad idea. In general, it is impossible today to use the exec plugin mechanism to attempt to support request signing. I am just questioning whether there is, would it be worth attempting to write a KEP that proposes an external process, executing an external process for request signing from Clientgo, or is that a non-starter?
I think for context too, this came up early from discussions I was having with, I think, Mo and some other folks about adding request signing to Kubernetes. And I think from my recollection, this was around the same time as there's a KEP to add what was it, YubiKey or something for every request in the client.
Yeah.
Jordan, were you going to say something about that?
I'm just trying to remember. I think the two sort of schools of thought were, one was having a way for exec plugins to do request signing, and the other was making kubectl talk through a proxy. And whatever you want to do with requests, if you want to sign them or whatever you want to do, I think we can mostly do with running a proxy, like a local authentication proxy that decorates requests however we want. I'm sorry, I'm paging this back in. I can't remember if there were gaps with that approach. I mean, it certainly seems more lightweight, especially now that we have proxy URL support in kubeconfig. So you can point kubeconfig or kubectl at a proxy and have it talk to that. Were there other issues?
Is that, I mean, then if you're thinking of some developer on their laptop, to me that seems slightly more onerous than the exec method, but I guess in other senses, other clients, it might make more sense.
I think there are performance implications around the exec method. Like if you're execing a process for every request, that was
totally. I totally get that. I think it would be worth measuring.
I think an open HTTP proxy that just signs requests is a little scary. On the client side, if you just had if you said a set HTTP proxy environment variable for kubectl and it just talked to some proxy, an external process.
It doesn't have to be open, right? kubectl can still say talk to this proxy and here are the credentials to talk to the proxy.
Okay.
And then, so assuming you start your signing proxy and it decorates your kubeconfig and configures proxy URL and puts in the short-lived credentials. So you say start my proxy and you tap your YubiKey and you get a short-term credential. Now it's not an open proxy, only kubeconfig can talk to that proxy. And then the proxy does whatever signing it does. That's what I was envisioning, but I wasn't sure if there were gaps there that I was missing.
Gotcha. Okay. I'll have to look into that. I just wasn't as familiar with that. I thought it was more just open corporate proxy, point to your HTTPS proxy kind of a thing.
I mean, that's certainly the normal use of proxy URL, right? But it wouldn't have to be. You could use that to talk to a local thing that is short-lived and authenticated. So.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So I'll take a look at the short-lived local proxy possibility. But other than that, I mean, is there strong resistance to the general idea? And would people be open to a KEP?
I mean, I think the main question, and I think Mo even brought this up early on, was like, if we're inventing an API for request signing, like, is that really what we want to do? Or
inventing an API?
Yes.
There's not a real standard out there at this point for request signing. Like there's some IETF drafts out there.
Okay.
AWS
Well,
obviously has our format, but
yeah, I was thinking more of just providing the ability for, in our case, we have a method of request signing. We can, we don't need to build it into Kubernetes other than just providing a mechanism for the client to get its requests signed. I think that's the only thing that we would need for us to implement request signing. So I don't know that we need to wade into adding like a specific implementation of request signing to Kubernetes, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I think the question is just about like how do we communicate all the relevant attributes of the request to the exec plugin, and how does it, like, what does it give back to us that we include? Like, is it all the headers, the URL and headers, method URL and headers, body content? It's just a much bigger surface area than what we have today, which is give me either a client or a token to send to the server. So it's a lot less clear like what the inputs and outputs of that are. And
yeah,
there aren't super standard things around request signing, we'd sort of be making it up or trying to jump onto like a draft thing with IETF. Whereas if you're talking to a proxy, it's like, what information does the proxy have about the request? All of it, because here's all the requests. Like, use what you want, and we're not having to invent anything. It's just HTTP proxy to the local proxy, and it does whatever it wants. So.
Okay, yeah. So I think like both of those make sense. And in the case of execing, I would think we would do the entire request too. But yeah, the proxy method seems totally reasonable.
At least starting with that and seeing how far you get and seeing if there are blockers. Anytime we can make progress quickly and without inventing new things that are specific to Kubernetes, I think that's probably a win.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. Do you have a clear idea of next steps there, Nick?
Yeah, I think explore the proxy approach. I can explore both of the approaches in a KEP, but it sounds like proxy is a little bit favored because there's less stuff we'd have to invent. So see if that makes sense after writing it down. But I'll spend a little bit of time on the alternative as well.
All right, thanks. All right, pod security policy. Tabitha, do you have a status update?
Yeah, I promise not to take up the entire meeting with pod security policy this time.
I think that's all we have left. So.
But I definitely appreciated the way that we all had a lot to share at the last meeting because, I mean, honestly, it's super informative. And so just wanted to let everybody know, in light of the discussion that we had that took over the entire last meeting, that we are working on what will be eventually a draft for a Google Doc to circulate around to everybody and do all of the massive amount of socialization and gathering of points of view that will be needed to succeed at replacing pod security policy before turning it into a cap. That way people can have the arguments while change is still easier. But in a desire to come with something that's specific enough to agree or disagree with, there's work ongoing before it's really specific enough to even bring around for wider socialization. So I just wanted to make sure to pop in and say, yep, this is a thing that's happening, and there will be more to talk about in the future.
I think the one of the things towards the end of the last meeting, I think we realized we were talking past each other a little bit in terms of like wanting to preserve a way to have controls around these things, and not just kicking everything out of tree. Like I think there's a desire to have something that can serve most people's use cases, and so that sounds like what you're working on. Just given sort of the baggage of API compatibility, I don't think that thing is like literally pod security policy objects as they are.
Yeah, I think that it must absolutely be something else,
and so
because of API compatibility.
Yeah,
but it's conceptually pod security policy.
Yeah, pod security policy, the good parts. So I think I'm really glad to see attention on it. I don't think that changes the trajectory of the current API, but having a thing to tell people like, we're not just abandoning this concept. There is work happening. Here's where that work is happening. I think that's helpful for people. Given that we don't anticipate graduating the current API, I think it's still useful to mark it as deprecated, just as a signal to like, if you're not already using it, you shouldn't start using it. Like, don't jump on this bandwagon. Like, wait for the thing we're working on to like jump into this. If you're new to Kubernetes, like, you probably don't want to start investing in the current pod security policy API. And so I think the sooner we can signal
have
that,
something that's have something that's like in the public notes to the SIG security meeting and the sig-auth meeting and in the Slack channels and in the email lists. Yeah, agreed.
So I would like to see us go ahead and mark pod security policy as deprecated and have whatever draft state, like even if it's early, I would err on the side of early just to have a place to point people. Like, this is where the conversation's going. So if
yeah,
we can
that all totally makes sense to me.
Communicates well to people and helps them understand. Like, don't start using pod security policy if you're not already. If you are using it, pay attention to here. This is where you're going to want to watch.
Yeah. And actually, to put a fine point on those concerns, my understanding is that pod security policy will be marked deprecated in 122.
Well, I think I would actually consider moving that up. If we know the answer is now that we aren't going to take it forward, and I think we do, that API won't be the future, we can go ahead and mark it as early as 121. I don't think I try to retcon it into 120, but
yeah,
121 we know.
We could do that and not move the end date. So yeah, like there's a minimum of like mark deprecated must remain for 3 releases. So the original plan was deprecated in 122, no longer served in 125. If we know that it's not graduating, I think it's helpful for people to communicate that earlier. So I would mark it deprecated in 121 and keep it no longer served at 125. So don't move the end, like keep the end where we've been saying it's going to be. But just in the interest of communication, because right now, someone new to Kubernetes, is like, oh, let me look at these APIs. There's this beta API, cool. And they start using it. And we know like in 3 months or 4 months in 122, they were going to start getting a warning about, oh, nope, deprecated. I think it's just kind to communicate as far in advance as we can that this thing is not going to graduate.
And you know, I think
I
think I agree with that, especially if we're talking about 121. Since 121 is a ways off, that should be plenty of time to get a robust public discussion going about what the replacement is going to look like. And I would want to also reserve the right to extend out the end date, because what I would really like to see is for there to be no dead zone where PSP has been removed, but there isn't a good alternative for people to migrate onto, especially since, at least at this stage in the discussion, one of the primary goals is to make migrating from PSP as painless as possible for people. Like, it clearly won't be the exact same API object, but to make the migration for people who have used PSP relatively painless, I would want there to be a good overlap between the ramp up of whatever, PSP++ ends up being called, just to make sure that people have a good chance to move on to it, have feedback during beta. Ideally, I would love to see it graduate before we remove PSP completely, but at least having it be in a solid beta that has had, releases and people using it.
Yeah, I appreciate the desire to have a migration path. I wouldn't want to commit to extending PSP at this point. I think 125 is a significant distance away.
It should be plenty of time. Agreed.
I would actually like to keep that and let it spur urgency and involvement in making progress on this. I'd like to keep that stake in the ground and say, this is the date. That's why this needs attention. If you're interested, come participate and contribute and make progress now on this.
I'm willing to agree with that, but I would be very opposed to that going a little further to, everybody needs to panic, rush out of PSP now. Like if that makes sense. I agree with your desire to have it, as a carrot to move things along, but I think that the messaging around it is important.
Yeah, the more clear we can have the plan at the end of 121, like when this reaches public perception, the better.
The easier everything else will be, 100%.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all I got. Anybody want to add anything to that right now?
Is there any data available on the usage of PSPs?
I don't know who would have that data.
What kind of usage would you be looking for?
Just whether they're used or not, right? Because I think one of the challenges, obviously, that has been discussed has been that they're hard to use in production. So it would be interesting to know to help decide if a migration or path needs to be planned, or if it can be a clean break and a redesign.
They're definitely used. I don't know if there's any public data on what percentage of production clusters are using them or something like that.
Okay.
Unless any of the large cloud providers want to volunteer that data.
I wouldn't be mad about having access to that data.
I wouldn't exclude all the on-prem customers either.
I'd be horrified if that data was somehow available to cloud providers.
I mean, like cloud providers running a cluster have some
Like I can
insight?
say, I mean, we enable it for all our clusters. So technically all EKS customers are using it. Like they might not be aware because they have a permissive policy, but it's used everywhere. So I think to the point that yes, a lot of people use it is probably sufficient for just design it, like how we want to design what the next version looks like.
Speaking as one of the people responsible for it, I feel like I can say this: if you're using it and you're not aware of it, you're probably not benefiting from it at all. Like if your policy is so permissive that you don't even recognize that it's restricting you, then I question whether it's doing you much good. But yeah.
But if it's turned on by default, you may have like specific groups of users, say in a multi-tenant cluster, who have done more interesting things without you being aware.
It's certainly possible, but it's so high friction to like
with the
and
bindings.
Because it's additive, like if you don't know that you're being restricted by it, then that has to mean that there's like a permissive policy granted to all namespaces or something like really unfortunate like that. And if that exists, then it doesn't matter how clever you get in a particular namespace, you're still covered by the permissive one. And it's totally unsafe to like, okay, we're going to take this working cluster that's super happy and we're just going to drop that permissive policy. It's like, oh, well, now you don't have a working cluster. So yeah.
As we kind of work through the design, kind of to tie it back to the earlier discussion on mirror pods, one of the problems that we've called out with the existing pod security policy is that the API is sort of unbounded. It's unclear what goes in there or where we stop adding things to it, which is one of the things that appeals about something like OPA or Gatekeeper, where it's the entire API surface and write arbitrary policies on it. So what I would encourage us to think about as we design the new version is what the threat model that we want to support out of the box in Kubernetes is, and scope the restrictions that the PSP has to only what is required to support that threat model. Does that make sense?
The people who are yelling about this are also the people who frequently go on stage and say threat model your things and make decisions from it. So yeah, 100%.
And maybe to give a kind of a concrete example there, the external IP issue that we published on Monday is an example of something where I wouldn't necessarily want to see that in the default pod security policy. First of all, it's not a pod, but like if it were, that's not explicitly a privilege escalation. That's more a like traffic interception in a multi-tenant environment. So kind of being clear about like where we draw the lines on things like that. Like, a pod, like, is there an information leak? Is this escalating to privileged on the node, privileged in the cluster? Are we just talking about hardening the container boundary, those sorts of things?
That kind of specificity would also help folks who were on the fence deciding between PSP++ and some other more general purpose admission controller, which one was more suitable for their needs.
Yeah.
I'm frantically taking notes, but feel free to add or clarify anything if I missed what people said. So.
Great, I think we should call it there. We will cancel the next sig-auth think that would be on the 23rd. So our next meeting will be on January 6th. So see you all next year.
See ya.